one of my reservations about doing my yoga teacher training was yoga is a practice that originated in India. It's been exported to us here in the West and in a lot of ways kind of co-opted by capitalism to be quite cost prohibitive to participate in, to be quite removed from some of the other aspects, the other limbs of yoga, apart from the physical movement limb, the asana limb. So I had some reservations on like, does the world really need another like white passing girl teaching yoga on the internet or wherever, right? And what can I do to be part of honoring yoga's Indian roots, and all the kind of steps in between that are part of yoga's journey to arrive with us here in Canada where we're practicing. One of the things that made me feel like I could do this work in a responsible and ethical way was the fact that like I'm mixed race myself, and I really believe that we can learn to authentically understand and share concepts that come from other cultures. And I think that's something I've had to learn as a person, navigating my Chinese heritage, navigating my Ukrainian heritage, what have you. And in so many ways, I try to do that in my own yogic practice. And one of the things that I did, and there's a lot of scholars, I've done a lot of reading on this topic, and we'll link some of them in the video description, but a lot of great folks are writing on this topic. A lot of wonderful Desi practitioners helping us folks who are not of Desi descendant to understand what can we do to honor this tradition authentically. And so it'd be things like doing a spiritual lineage acknowledgement at the start of my class. For example, I teach in some styles like rocket yoga, which has come down to us here in the West through Patabi Joyce's codified Ashtanga series, so the Ashtanga primary series, the Ashtanga intermediate series. Patabi Joyce trained in this style and passed it on to students like Larry Schultz, who is the person who originated the rocket sequence. So at the start of my classes, I would acknowledge that kind of chain. Yoga has been practiced in India for thousands of years. Patabi Joyce came around and came up with this sequence, the Ashtanga primary sequence. Larry Schultz took that and exported it to his students in California, and I learned it from a variety of other teachers, and I'm here teaching it today as a result of that long chain in history. And I think that's really beautiful. It's really neat, and when students find out that you're participating in this thing that has its roots in a history that we can trace practitioner to practitioner, that's kind of special. In some of the teaching that you do, how did you arrive there? Like, what was the journey you took to be leading a restorative class, for example?
Restorative was not called restorative back then, but Iyengar, who was one of the Indian gurus, was doing more of an Ashtanga style series himself, and he had quite a lot of injuries, quite a lot of health issues, and so he developed his own Iyengar method, which is really heavily use of props, lots of inversions and
we
things.
Love props.
Yes. And he started to call it like a slow yoga that he created of his own, that was a slower version, that was more renewing, that could help you to balance the more physical challenging vinyasa style practices. And then he brought it to the West, to Judith Lassiter in the States, who then packaged it as restorative yoga and kind of came up with some of its key concepts, right? That we are holding poses for 8 to 14 minutes so that we can engage the parasympathetic nervous system. It has, in theory, the idea of the physical practice, but the thing I spend the most amount of time explaining to people is like, you're not there to set your props up to facilitate a deep stretch. You are there to facilitate your nervous system attaining some slowness, some calmness. A lot of the time when I talk to non-yoga people, one of the big feedback I hear is, I'd love to go to a yoga class, but if I read the schedule, like, I don't know what Ashtanga or Vinyasa or Yin or Hatha, like, what even is Hatha, right? And you and I've even had those classes because you do more power styles of yoga.
Like, am I teaching a Hatha class? Like, sometimes if we're just there for a long time and we find a bunch of breath in one shape and then move on to another shape, is that a Hatha class? I think the definitions they're not as hard and fast, and I think it varies. Are these labels even helpful? And then how much of these labels are, authentically understanding the journey that these different practices, styles of practice made to us here, like from India, across the ocean to us here in the West, versus are they things that other folks have slapped on to package classes more easily to some audiences. I think about like a power yoga class or like a de-stress and get happy class, or like you see some interesting names on
Yes.
yoga studio schedules, and it's not, I'm
What
not calling anyone out, but it's just, I think it's all of us trying to navigate this. How do we make this accessible for folks while honoring the tradition that it comes from,
yeah, if we let go of some of the Sanskrit names of things, it makes it more palatable to a Western audience
Right.
who we don't have that understanding
Yeah.
culturally. But then also, yeah, what are you doing with your acknowledging the practice,
Yeah.
right? And also, like, I think many of us have had the experience of going to a yoga class where you were like, oh, that was actually just like a high intensity fit class, or like a
Right.
Pilates class
Yeah.
that wasn't necessarily the heritage. And
Yeah. And then why are you calling it yoga? If you're stripping out some of those other elements of yoga, but does that mean you have to use Sanskrit when you're teaching your classes? Does that mean that you have to engage all 8 limbs of yoga when you're teaching your classes? Like, I would argue no, because can we do all of that well in the 60 minutes we have allotted to us? But is there some way that we can incorporate, whether it is a lineage acknowledgement, whether it is, diving into a yogic myth associated with a particular asana, should your class allow, that we can continue to acknowledge, like, hey, this isn't something we made up here in Canada or in the States or wherever you might be. This is something that has a tradition and a history. And the way, again, like coming back to where I started, like I've reconciled my role as an educator here is that I've done a lot of reading and learning about it. I've learned a lot of the Sanskrit names for poses, and I use those where I can. But at the same time, I think you have to meet people where they're at, and not overwhelm with your intent to do good and to educate, but to find this balance. And I'm not saying it's easy between, giving the deference the tradition deserves and also acknowledging that people are coming in carrying so much other information, and that they are looking often when you come to a yoga class for a little settled. Yeah. And I think that is a very yogic goal to have as we think about moving further up the yogic ladder of the limbs. We are looking towards a state of mindful reflection, self-awareness, a sense of settled, a sense of the separation between like the active thoughtful mind and the like sensory feeling body.
I think that's also why we hold the label of yoga teacher, but usually when we define this teaching practice of ours, we define ourselves as movement teachers, because we both do teach the functional movement and the myofascial rolling.
Yeah.
And it's not that you can't have some of those other limbs of yoga in there, but that is not its core intention. That is not its core birthplace. And so I find some of the ways, it's not a perfect system, but some of the ways that I spread that education is like using our blog and doing some of those deep dives and making little videos like this that are about the practice, but it's more the non-physical parts of the practice. And then for me, also incorporating pranayama and the karmic yoga side of it. Like, how do we do these free things where we are giving back, where we are engaging in
like
community?
Working with local community organizations to offer pro bono classes. Like, these are some of the things we do to try to embody the yamas and niyamas. How do you take some of these ethical precepts and social observances that we should try to aspire to live by to embody that sense of the teachings of yoga through action? I think that there is a place for acknowledging that we are all on our own journey. And one of the reasons you click on a yoga video and not just a generic stretching video is because there's some part of you that might be interested in that, or maybe not. And maybe you're just learning about all these other limbs of yoga now. Like, wherever you are on the journey, we'll try to meet you where you're at and offer some opportunities for further exploration. And I like that you mentioned our blog, because I think that's a place where we do some of our own, like, kind of thinking out loud, almost just like this video. But I think that's Svadhyaya, that's one of our yogic precepts to live by, is this continual active self-study. So I guess if you're a movement educator, especially if you work in the yoga space, tell us how you navigate this. How are you honoring yoga's roots? If you're a student, do you love to hear Sanskrit? Do you love to learn about some of the yogic myths? Like, what helps you gain a greater appreciation of this practice? Because I think at the end of the day, as white practitioners, we're trying to spread awareness, spread appreciation. The difference, Susanna Barakataki, one of my go-to scholars on this topic, writes about the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. And I think, like, as inhabiting white bodies like we do, the most we can do is appreciate the culture in an informed way, take the time to get educated, and share that with our students as best we can.